And from what I hear, there's a lot of food left, which means that we're going to have another break at some point to eat more.
That's correct.
So, as some of you pointed out, this was a bit of a warm-up for the main thing, which is automatic transcription. Before doing so, do you have any questions so far? Okay. So now is a brief overview of what is happening in research in automatic music transcription. I will start off first with a more historical overview of the field. Then moving on to more recent methods, which mostly are separated into what we call spectrographic composition, and then classification-based methods, which also includes the up-to-date stuff, including deep learning, neural networks, and so on. We usually separate transcription into 3 different tasks. One is what we call frame-level transcription, note-level transcription, and string-level transcription. And what do we mean by that? Frame-level transcription is basically when we identify the pitches for one time instant only. We don't really follow them over time. So we get something a bit noisy like this. A note-level transcription is supposed to identify a note as identified by a pitch, an onset, and an offset, a start and end time. So this is getting a bit more high level towards maybe the way that we humans might transcribe pitches. And then we have stream level transcription, which is not only identifying the notes, but is also assigning each note to a specific source. The source could be a voice, an instrument, as followed over time. Generally in research, there's lots and lots of methods on the first thing, the frame level transcription, fewer methods for coming up with a note level transcription. A note level transcription might be something that we might have in a MIDI file, for instance. MIDI files, to those who have seen them, is essentially a list of notes identified by pitch, onset, and offset in terms of seconds and beats. And there's only a handful of methods that do the final thing, the stream level transcription, or some people call it instrument assignment or timbre tracking. Another test. So, chord number 1. How many pitches did you listen? Okay, 3 or 2, 4. Okay, okay, I'm gonna play that again. 3, 2, 3, 4. 2. Okay. How about this one? 3. 3. Okay. So this is 3 here. This one? 2. Yep. Anyone with an absolute pitch? C? Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yep, almost. F major. Yeah. So yeah, 2 and 3 pitches. And this is even more interesting now. This is the stream level task. So again, C and G, 2 instruments playing that. C, F, and A, 3 instruments playing that. Do you see any commonalities in terms of instruments between the 2? Yeah, the instrument playing the C is the same. Yeah, I think I picked that myself, but the rest, not really. It's kind of tough. And there was a question by someone in the audience, so about different instruments. How are they different in terms of frequency content? Do they have different frequencies? The answer is no, they don't necessarily have different frequencies, but the magnitude in the spectrum is different. So let's say if we have the piano, the spectrum might look something like this. So it's slowly decaying. each harmonic is slowly decaying in terms of magnitude. Whereas, let's say, if we have the violin, it might be a bit more constant. If we have the clarinet, then every odd harmonic, every even harmonic is suppressed. So there's some differences. In terms of how we separate these frame-based methods, we can use the time domain signal, the waveform, as input. We can use a frequency representation, such as the spectrogram over here, or a hybrid approach. We can use a bunch of different time or frequency representations. Now getting a bit into more signal processing, the standard representation that people might use would be the short time Fourier transform spectrogram, STFT spectrogram. A representation that's a bit more closer to the way that at least we humans are supposed to perceive sounds could be the CQT spectrogram. Nowadays, with deep learning, a lot of people use the MEL spectrogram. And in terms of methodologies for identifying those pitches, so these are the features that we use. In terms of methods, this could be done in a signal processing way, coming up with some rules, could be based on probability theory, statistics, could be based a bit on more principled Bayesian statistics, using maybe classification methods as well, we can do that. Neural networks also falling under that. Could be under this spectrogram decomposition or matrix factorization methods, or sparse coding, which is also related. So there's quite a few different methodologies, and this is why I was saying before there's no real consensus on what is the best method for the task. Another design choice is whether to jointly estimate all nodes at the same time for a given time frame, or to do that in an iterative fashion. Which means that first we identify the most prominent node, and then we identify the second most prominent node until we run out of nodes to detect. So historically, close to 10 years ago, most of the research was done in the time domain signal, the waveform directly, which maybe we're coming full circle now with the end-to-end methods, which is a different story. The idea back then was that, because harmonic sounds are periodic, so they have some sort of basic periodicities, we can use pitch perception models which rely on the autocorrelation function to find the main period of the signal. So if we have this as input, and we compute the autocorrelation, we come up with something like this. And we say that the peak, the first non-zero peak, the largest non-zero peak, corresponds to the fundamental period of the signal. And if we know the fundamental period, then we know the fundamental frequency, then we know the pitch. That's fine, but when computing the autocorrelation, you also get peaks at integers of the fundamental period. So you end up with what we call subharmonic errors. It means that you're not really sure if you're detecting a C4 or if you're detecting in fact a C3 or a C2, maybe you're detecting all of them together. And especially when you have many sounds that are mixed together, many concurrent nodes, then the autocorrelation function is even more noisy, so it's really hard to make sense of it. Based on the autocorrelation, there were a few systems designed. The idea was at the time we have as inputs a waveform, and then we have a series of filters to compute the autocorrelation at specific frequency regions in a quite similar way to how we humans are supposed to process sounds. And based on this sort of principles as a combination of signal processing and auditory science, there were systems that at that time were good enough, but they were struggling in the case of polyphonic music when you have multiple pitches. Then people started to look a bit more into Bayesian statistics. What if we can come up with a completely parametric model that is able to, let's say, synthesize sounds as a combination of specific parameters. So we say that, we assume that sounds are completely sinusoidal. Have sinusoids, We have specific frequencies and their harmonics. And for each harmonic, we have a specific amplitude, like this one here. So each one of these harmonics has different amplitude, which is reflected by this. We also have a bit of noise, just to make sure, because signals are noisy, of course. And making sense of all these parameters from an input is a nightmare. It's okay, it's a nice mathematical model, but it doesn't really work. It's quite rigid, even still, because music signals are not purely harmonic. There's a lot of transients, there's a lot of inharmonicity implied, and also the amplitudes of harmonics also don't stay like that always. They decay in different ways when notes decay. They might evolve in different ways according to the playing technique that is used. They have different values according to the instrument that is present, so if you have a mixture of instruments, then this model simply doesn't work. Therefore, I could say that this line of research has been somewhat discontinued at the moment. Then, I think in the early 2000s, people started more investigating towards the frequency domain. So the key idea here is that each pitch has a set of harmonics. This is a C4 note, and it has a series of harmonics. Can we try to recognize the pattern? The problem with frequency domain methods, as opposed to time domain methods, is that they have a lot of harmonic errors. Harmonic error is, let's say that when you have a signal with a C4 note, then you end up detecting a C4, a C5, and a G5, and so on. Whereas the time domain methods usually suffer from the opposite, the subharmonic errors. The other problem is, as mentioned before, that the harmonic amplitude varies. It varies between instruments, it varies when notes evolve over time, it varies between different techniques. So it's not as simple as having just one pattern like that and trying to find this pattern in your signal. And the other added bonus is the overlapping harmonics thing. When you have harmonics that overlap in frequency, let's say that you have another sound that has this kind of amplitude here. But if they are mixed together, if you add this and this, it doesn't come up with this. The end result is actually depends a lot on the phase of the pitches. So you can get pretty much any value between 0 and the maximum and the sum of these two magnitudes. So adding notes together doesn't work. Spectrum is complex. It's not an additive model. So you cannot simply use a pattern and use that to detect things. So it's these models didn't really work, although at the time, Ansi Klapuri, who's now was one of the main researchers in music transcription, 2000s, nowadays at musician in Finland, he came up with this method that was for quite a lot of time state of the art. The idea was that let's try to detect the most prominent pitch, and we start off from the lower frequencies, we detect the most prominent peak, we detect the pitch, and then we subtract that. And then we find the second most prominent pitch. We subtract that, and so on, until nothing's left out in the spectrum. Actually, this method kind of works, at least for certain types of instruments, piano and guitar. It's very simple, it's fast, you can do that in real time, which is good. At the same time, it's a bit hard to subtract the appropriate amount of energy. You don't, because, again, spectra are not really additive, it's difficult to know how much you need to subtract. Another line of thought was by Jiao Zhuang, who was trying to look not into the whole spectrum, the whole vector, but just on the peaks, trying to make sense of the peaks. So try to do some peak picking on the signal and select potential candidates for pitches, and then computing different combinations of pitches if they work or not. It's intuitive, it does work well, It is sensitive though to peak detection, and again, because of the fact that different sound sources have different amplitudes and magnitudes of the spectrum, it is a bit difficult to detect those peaks in case these sources have different loudnesses. And based on that, was a bit of an update on this, where he was trying to detect the probability of finding a peak in the spectrum versus the probability of not having a peak in the spectrum. Again, the problem was that some softer nodes with less loudness were a bit masked, so they were not really easy to detect. A lot of work in Japan was done on trying to model the problem of transcription and also other related problems such as singing, voice separation, lyrics alignment, and so on, using Gaussians. The idea being, a Gaussian is a bell-shaped distribution with a specific mean and a variance, standard deviation. And what if we can represent the spectrum of a harmonic sound as a collection of Gaussians? Each Gaussian will be centered around the position of the fundamental and its harmonics. Each Gaussian would have, so the mean would be actually the position of the fundamental and harmonics. It would have a certain standard deviation appropriate for harmonic. And then we also model the magnitudes of these Gaussians. So we treat mixtures of different nodes as mixtures of Gaussians. And this is actually kind of nice. It works quite well. Again, it's quite efficient method. These kinds of methods are based on mixtures of Gaussians, more formally called Gaussian mixture models. They are quite quick to perform inference, to come up with a result. You can also incorporate some more high-level knowledge, maybe from music theory. That's nice. But again, the model is relatively rigid in the sense that it doesn't model inharmonicity. So it assumes that the position of the harmonics is fixed, but this doesn't happen in all cases. It assumes that the signal, again, is purely harmonic, which is not the case because, for example, if we try to view the spectrum of a piano, then maybe things get a bit more tricky. So the piano notes, we usually say that it can consist of 3 or 4 parts in its evolution. It has the attack part, it has the steady state part, and it has a decay part. And the attack part is the point where the hammer hits a string. So this is pretty much a percussive sort of action. And in fact, the spectrum is noisy. It's noisy. Then we have the steady part of the note, where the strings start to vibrate. At some point, the string will start to decay, and then you might have maybe a slightly different pattern with most of the upper harmonics being removed or attenuated. And this kind of model is not able to support this kind of thing. The temporal evolution of the notes. Which brings me to a slightly more recent family of methods, which was based on the principle of spectrum decomposition. This family of methods consists of mostly 2 main algorithms, which are called non-negative matrix factorization, NMF, and its probabilistic counterpart, probabilistic latent component analysis, PLCA. This can be demonstrated by an example. So this is a short segment from a Bach fugue. This is the spectrogram. This piano, so you see one note, another note enters, another note here. You have, I think, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 events in the spectrum. and 5 unique nodes. If we try to view the spectrum as an image, as a two-dimensional representation, and try to express it as the product of two matrices, then this NMF method comes up with these two matrices. The first one maybe somehow miraculously identifies the spectral signatures of each unique sound event present in a signal. You have 5 unique nodes in a signal. It identifies the spectral profile of each of these nodes. And the other matrix, it detects the timings, the activations for each node, corresponding node here. So it tells you that this particular node is active somehow in the middle of the signal here. So this matrix here has a number of nodes over frequency. These are the spectral profiles of the nodes. And this matrix here has the activations of these nodes. So these are nodes over time. And this is actually the transcription in the end. That's something we can use to do a transcription. Based on this, we can say that, okay, so we have 1, 2, 3 nodes being active, and this is the actual pitch. Here we have 1 node towards the end being active, and this is its pitch, and so on. The way that NMF works is that it assumes a parts-based representation. It assumes that you have as input a non-negative representation, such as the magnitude spectrogram, and you are trying to decompose it into 2 other matrices, W and H, both of which are non-negative as well. What this thing does is that it tries to break down the original input into its parts, its basic components. This method was inspired by image processing, where it was used in face recognition, and it was shown that given a face, it can decompose the face into its basic components, the nose, the eyes, the ears, and so on. In a similar fashion, NMF is able to decompose the spectrogram into its basic components, the sound events, the notes, essentially, and show us where they are activated over time. These particular algorithm, because of the non-negativity constraints, it imposes this additive assumption, is that basically you have objects, sound objects that are just added on top of each other in order to create a spectrogram. As an algorithm by itself, it's quite fast. It's just a few matrix multiplications, therefore quite efficient, and has been used quite a lot the past 10 years or so to come up with transcription systems. One way of doing so would be to try, so we assume that this V here is our input spectrogram. This W here is our training data, our dictionary of sounds, of notes. We have a dictionary of notes, maybe from different instruments as well. And what we're trying to find is H, which is the activation of these notes. When is each node active over time? So usually people create in a training step a dictionary. This is a spectral dictionary, so this is the MIDI pitch here over the x-axis, and here is the frequency axis here. So we have a series of spectral templates across pitch. This is our W here. And this is an example of the output that we get, the H matrix, the activation matrix, which is basically the pitches. How are they active over time? This is relatively similar to what we call a piano roll representation. A piano roll representation is a binary representation over pitch and time. Yeah.
So the dictionary is ordered beforehand, or is just one? So dictionary.
Yeah. So the question to those who didn't listen to that, is the dictionary ordered beforehand or is it learned in an unsupervised way? Both options can be done. One option is to have a supervised approach, so you set up the dictionary by yourself, you order it by yourself. Another approach is you just give this as input, you let it run, and you let it compute both the dictionary and the activations. If you don't put any more constraints, then it won't really work. So you need to add a few more constraints about maybe the instrument, maybe the kind of music that you have in order to come up with a meaningful solution. Yeah. Yeah. So this is a purely supervised approach where you set the dictionary yourself and you learn the output, you infer the output. And based on this, a few people have incorporated also additional knowledge. But overall, the problem is that if the test audio doesn't match your dictionary, then the method just doesn't work. Even if you have trained your data with an upright piano and you test it on a grand piano, then it wouldn't work. If you record your data for the same instrument using your smartphone and you test using a high quality microphone, it wouldn't work. Of course, there are ways to get around to this. On the good hand, though, is that this particular method is quite strong if you have good knowledge about the instrument and the instrument model you want to transcribe. So saying, I want to transcribe recordings from a Steinway piano. And you train it on a Steinway piano, using only a few samples. Doesn't need a lot of samples, and then it works. And it works also in real time as well, which is good. Another approach, which was the second part of your question, is what if we don't set the dictionary ourselves and we let it learn by itself? And this has also been approached, this adaptive NMF method, so to speak, which also has some constraints on how spectra are being created. Otherwise, the dictionary that we would learn would be not very meaningful. And it actually works quite well, but again, it has quite strong assumptions about strictly harmonic sounds, which is not always the case. Lack of transient components, so we cannot really model the attack of the piano like that. And relying on a good initialization. So this is the state of the art. From one hand is these spectrogram decomposition methods that, again, recapping, take as input a spectrogram, an image such as this one, and this is the non-negative matrix V, and they decompose it into two matrices. One is the dictionary of the notes that we have and the instruments, and the other is the main transcription output, the encoding matrix or the activation matrix. Again, overall, these methods, they are able to work with little data, and they're able to work fast, but they don't really adapt well to different environments. Maybe in machine learning speak, domain adaptation using these methods is not quite there yet. An equivalent method was also proposed a few years back, which is called probabilistic latent component analysis. It is the same principle with NMF. It takes as input one two-dimensional representation and decomposes it into two other matrices, one the dictionary and the other the activation. The difference being is that here we represent concepts with probabilities. And why do that? We can do that because then, based on other elements from probability theory and statistics, we can incorporate other kinds of models, such as hidden Markov models, which are widely used to track things over time, maybe. Or we can impose priors, our prior knowledge in the form of probabilities. Based on this, there are also models proposed as extensions of NMF and PLCA, of these spectrum decomposition methods, that were trying to not have that additive parts-based representation, but we're now trying to extract shifted structures out of data, so-called convoluted models. And this links quite nicely with the current sort of state-of-the-art, which is convolutional neural networks. It's the same principle. In both convolutional neural networks and in these models, we have an image, and you're trying to extract some sort of structure within this image, a smaller image that is shifted somehow in a bigger image. How does that come into play here? This spectrum here on the left is the spectrum of volume glissando. So what happens here? If we plot the spectrum in a log frequency axis, so this is not Hertz anymore. Hertz is a linear frequency axis. If we plot the frequency in a logarithmic scale, what happens is that all the intervals between harmonics are the same across different notes, across different pitches. This is slightly tricky, I'm going to say it again. If we plot the spectrum in the low frequency axis, then the spacings between different harmonics are always the same across different notes. And this is kind of useful if we do music signal processing, because that means that we can express the whole spectrogram as one pattern, like this one here, one spectral pattern, which is simply moved vertically. So essentially what we do is we take one pattern and we convolve it with a vertical shift in order to produce this image here. This is the same exact principle that neural networks have. So in order to produce this matrix, this is no longer a multiplication. This is a convolution. You have an input V. This is our spectrogram. And we approximate that as our dictionary, which is now convolved with an activation. This is actually quite useful property of music signals, is that if you view music signals in the low frequency domain, then you can simply represent different pitches as vertical shifts. You can have one pattern, you shift it just vertically in terms of low frequency, and then you can represent different pitches, and the pitch is the shift that you do, the vertical shift that you do. That's good. And then we can also do interesting things, like in this glissando example here. This is the resulting activation. You have something that increases and fluctuates a bit here. In the glissando case, it was a bit dull, and then it decays again. So you can model tuning changes and frequency modulations, which is nice if you want to do some music performance analysis. But these models are also quite computationally expensive. And in some cases, for example, in the piano, where piano doesn't really include any frequency modulations, the pitch of the piano is usually stable, doesn't really modulate, then you don't get an improvement. That was the first family of methods, which were all based on the principle of trying to decompose the spectrogram into parts, or to deconvolve the spectrogram into components. And the second main family of methods is the one that is based on classification approaches. They view transcription as a multi-label classification. Each quantized pitch is a class, and you either have positive examples where a pitch is active, a frame contains a pitch, or negative examples where the frame does not contain the pitch. It's a simple idea and doesn't really require a lot of acoustical and musicological knowledge. And the bad thing, though, is that you can only output a discrete set of classes, discrete pitches. The bad thing is that you also require a lot of training data in order to successfully train a system like that. It might overfit. It is also hard to adapt it to different instruments. A first approach by Dan Ellis, who's now moved on to Google, was to use what we call a support vector machine classifier to perform piano transcription. The idea is that for each note, he had one classifier. And this was the output that he was getting for piano music, for an example of piano music. And then he was also trying to smooth out the output using hidden Markov models, which is a commonly used method in signal processing to temporally smooth things. Can I have a quick raise of hands? How many of you are familiar with HMMs? Okay, so a quick recap might be then a good idea. So HMMs, or hidden Markov models, are directed graphical models where we have a series of observations over time. these are the observations. Why? We have a series of observations over time, and we want to infer something hidden based on those observations, something latent. And these hidden variables are linked. We assume that these are linked over time. HMMs are widely used in the case of speech recognition, have been used quite a lot, where the observations can be the spectrogram, the spectra of specific point in time of the speech signal, and the latent states are the phonemes or the words. So, and we assume that words are in fact linked over time, phonemes are linked over time. We are not able to view the words directly, we're able to view the signal, and we want to infer the words. This is the basic principle of hidden microphones. Over the past few years, the same principle used by HMMs has been now maybe replaced by the so-called recurrent neural networks, RNNs, which more or less rely on similar principles. Of course, they are a bit more powerful in some other ways. Which now brings me to neural networks. Show of hands, how many of you are familiar with neural networks? Okay, so about half of them. So what are neural networks? I guess that you also get to hear them in the sound and music computing class by Wandier. The idea is that they are systems which are inspired by biological neural networks, by the way that supposedly the human brain is organized and composed in terms of basic elements that we call neurons. The idea is that you create models which are based on these elements, which we call neurons. Each one of these neurons is essentially a function that has some sort of nonlinearity, a nonlinear function. And neural networks are collections of these nodes, of these neurons, placed together possibly in different, what we call layers. So we have one layer here, you have another layer here, and you have another layer here. Here we have an input. This is what we call a hidden layer, and this is our output layer. And the main reason for existence of neural networks is that they are very good function approximators. They are able to learn a nonlinear function from input to output using some sort of optimization algorithm. Usually nowadays, this optimization algorithm is something like stochastic gradient descent, for example. So this is essentially a model that takes some sort of input. It learns an output through by learning the weights of these connections between the nodes. It learns some sort of nonlinearities. And this particular example here is what we might call a feed-forward neural network, maybe the most basic case. For time series data, we have another version of a neural network, which is a recurrent neural network. The idea behind the neural network is that connections between nodes form a directed graph along a sequence. You have an input, which is a time series input. You have x of t plus 1, etc. And the input is linked to a hidden layer or more hidden layers, and it's also linked to an output layer. But the way that hidden layers evolve, the hidden layers are also connected across time. So this is kind of similar to the way that hidden Markov models are designed, so that the hidden variables, the hidden components, are assumed to be linked across time. And over the past few years, a few variants of recurrent neural networks have been proposed using different node organization, node units. These include gated recurrent units, long-term ternary networks, LSTMs for short. And this is maybe more or less the state of the art if we want to do time series, to analyze time series data. And the third and final variant of neural networks I wanted to quickly introduce includes convolutional neural networks. The principle of these convolutional neural networks is similar to what I was saying before with the convolutive models is that we want to extract a shifted structure out of some data. So we have an input which is two-dimensional or can be multidimensional, and we have a smaller structure here that we shift across the whole input. What we're trying to do, we convolve the input with the smaller structure that we call the filter, and we are trying to learn the filter. And we do that across several layers in order to come up with a final score, a final probability. So this involves a lot of convolutions, it involves a lot of subsampling for specific layers. I won't go into the details of CNNs, but the basic concept of these are used quite widely in image processing and video processing in order to learn objects and spatial relationships of those objects. And the same principle can be applied also to spectrograms, because we can view spectrograms as two-dimensional representations, although there's one attendee here who was Juan Bello's PhD student. Yep, there's you. As Juan Bello famously said, spectrograms are not images. I try to follow his advice. But maybe we can view them as images. So, what do people have been doing with neural networks for transcription? Sebastian Buch has been using this bidirectional log short-term memory networks for doing count transcription. He was also trying to incorporate some elements from signal processing, so using spectrums from different resolutions in order to extract features that would be able to represent both high frequencies and low frequencies as well. And it actually works very well for piano. It's actually an open source implementation, you can download that. The bad thing is that the method doesn't detect node durations. It only detects the nodes and their onset. And it also doesn't really work for anything else apart from piano. A bit more recently, Sridhar Sekti at Queen Mary, he did the whole bunch comparison of different neural networks for transcription, feed-forward networks, recurrent networks, convolutional networks, using the constant Q transform as representation, which is interesting because the constant Q transform is one of these low-frequency representations, which means that it's good for extracting shifted structures out of data. It is, or it was for some time, the state of the art. The bad thing is that the temporal resolution was low because this particular representation, it's nice and compact, but it doesn't really offer a good temporal resolution, especially for low pitch notes. And this is the end of the frame-based approach. It was the bulk of the state of the art. Do you have any questions so far? Okay, so what I did, basically, I was just recapping the frame-based approaches. I first did a sort of historical overview of people using the time domain or the frequency domain, using the autocorrelation or using rules from probability in order to detect pitches. And then the core state-of-the-art families are the spectrum decomposition methods, such as NMF, and a bit more recently, the methods that are based on neural networks, or deep learning as it's also called, which essentially they are trying to treat the transcription task as a classification task. And this was the frame level transcription problem, where we are trying to identify pitches instantaneously. The second problem is node level, node tracking, where there are much fewer methods. The idea for node tracking is that you don't want to just estimate pitches instantaneously. You want to let's say that this is a piano roll representation, this is pitch here, and this is time. You want to identify continuous notes with a start and an end position, which is a bit more close to how we humans might recognize sounds. One way to do that would be to use methods based on onset detection to detect the start times of the notes. Onset detection is a well-researched task in music information retrieval. But if your onset detection method doesn't work, then the note tracking method won't work. Another way to do that would be to post-process your frame level estimates. So having this as input and trying to detect the note starts and the note ends in each case. And the third approach is to do that directly from audio, which is the current state of the art. So again, the idea is that we have a frame level transcription. Could be a bit noisy, could be also non-binary, and we want to convert that into a binary representation where we have clear starting and end points of each note. The most straightforward way to do that, let's say we have that as input, is just to do a thresholding. This is, let's say that this is the output of a neural network, or this is the output of an NMF system. So this representation is non-binary. We just do thresholding. We say that all values below this value are 0, all values above this value are 1. We come up with this. Doesn't work very well because you might have small notes here and there, you might have small errors, you might have gaps as well. Maybe you can do some filtering in order to fill in small gaps. So let's say if we have a tiny gap, let's fill this in order to have a continuous note. It's a bit tricky. Or you can have hidden Markov models to track all the notes across time in order to come up with a clean representation. Another way is to also use hidden Markov models in a bit more musicological way to try to model the evolution of each note, which was done by Kapuri a few years ago. He was trying to model the sound states of notes, the attack part, the decay part, the steady state part of each note, and also the silence as well between the notes. And this actually kind of works well, you know. However, being HMMs, being the fact that these variables here have to be discrete, that means that this kind of method is only able to work if you want to detect the lead melody, one thing, and not a full polyphonic transcription. And the current state of the art for note tracking is the Google's approach. Google recently entered the arena for music transcription as part of the Google Brain and the Magenta teams. And they came up with a relatively complex neural network based on bidirectional long short-term memory networks. And it's actually two networks combined, one network for doing pitch detection and another network for doing onset detection. Jointly optimized, using as a representation the log-melt spectrogram, which is the go-to representation for all current deep learning research. It actually works extremely well for piano. One could say that nowadays the piano transcription problem has been solved by Google, despite the fact that it didn't have that much data in the end. It was only trained on a relatively small data set, which is interesting. I would encourage you to give it a go. In fact, the so-called onsets and frames, this is how they call it. This model, if you Google that, they do have a demo where you can upload your own piano recording and you can get the transcription out of that. And that was it about note tracking. Do you have any questions on this part? The training set, how small it is. It is about 8 gigabytes, which, depending on the definition of large or small, it's actually small. It was the MAPS database, which I will mention the link later on. If you want to download the database for training, you can do that as well.
You shown piano transcript, not transcript, at the beginning of before the break.
Yeah.
Was that on my research?
No. No.
When you guys ask questions, please speak loud.
Yeah, so the question is that I showed a few transcriptions earlier on where these transcriptions made from the Google model. The answer was no. Yeah.
So in the figure, we only see the onset conditions. How about the offset, the duration of the mean?
For the offsets, they are relying on they're not explicitly modeling offsets. I think it's based essentially on thresholding and median filtering approaches based on the frame predictions in order to determine the offsets. But given that this is piano music, offsets are not that important compared to onsets. That's the thing. It's hard even for a human to accurately determine the offset in a piano sound because there's just the decaying sound. So it's not that crucial. Whether this Google approach would work in other kinds of instruments which also have continuous sort of, they actually have an offset, remains to be seen. The implementation is not open source, so sure what to say. So to sum up on the comparison between, we recently did a comparison between NMF and neural networks. This was published just 1 week ago, the Signal Processing magazine. We were able to show that neural networks, they are able to represent complex manifolds in a robust way. A nice thing also neural networks is that they can be trained in an end-to-end fashion. In a sense, end-to-end means that basically you take the raw inputs and you immediately have a final decision without any intermediate handcrafted steps. However, NMF performs well on small data. There are some cases for transcription where you might not have enough data. In the past, I've been working on Greek. I have been working with Greek music, for instance. Other people have been working with harpsichords. There's not a huge amount of data in that case, and NMF is actually quite robust with working with little data. And it can also adapt to new conditions well enough. Just as we did a small example of the Google model along with the baseline NMF model to see how they work. Both models were trained on piano, and we tried to break the models to see what happens. And we tested the models on this kind of thing. So organ music. The thing about organ is that it's tricky. It's not only the spectrum doesn't have anything to do with the piano. In fact, the notes in an organ as actually they are composed as combinations of other notes, and you see harmonics where you shouldn't have harmonics, and the octave is also not very clear. In organ, you might have, depending on what we call the stops in an organ, you might have a whole set of weird things happening. So the top figure here shows the output of a baseline NMF method. So black represents correctly detected, red represents false alarms. So notes that were detected but should not have been detected. Blue represents misdetections. Below is the Google model. We see clearly that the Google model fails more gracefully compared to the NMF model. It still has a few false alarms, but because of the onset functionality, it is very good at clearly identifying the start and the end points of the notes. So this is how the output for the NMF model sounds like. So yeah, the main issue here is time is a mess because there's no temporal tracking, there's no onset detection. How about the Google one? So, still not perfect. Has a few errors, a few ambiguities on the octaves, maybe some subharmonic errors or some harmonic errors, but it's clearly good in the sense that it is tracking a note over time. of course, it remains to be seen whether and how we can successfully adapt such neural network models to new instruments or to unseen instruments, to new music styles and all that. That remains to be seen. Oh, sorry. I wasn't intending to do that, sorry. Oh. Okay. Right. Okay, something happens. Right. No hands. Yeah, okay. No, what happened? Here we are. Okay, cool. So this was the recap of the state of the art. The situation right now is that people are increasingly so using neural networks. And especially in the Google case, this has been proven successful for the piano scenario, and remains to be seen for other kinds of instruments. The last problem, where only a handful of methods have been proposed, is the stream level transcription, which is the most challenging one, because we don't only need to identify the notes, we also need to identify the instruments that produce that notes and to assign each note to a specific instrument source. We can do that in a supervised way. We can also do that in an unsupervised way. One approach by Giardouin was, let's say that we have a transcription, we have the notes. Let's try to link the notes together in a non-supervised way, to cluster the notes together and to form coherent streams. That's one approach. I think I need to restart PowerPoint. Sorry about that. Okay, so the second approach is also using spectral decomposition, where you represent each instrument by one spectral profile, and you're able to identify both pitches and the instruments. The bad thing about this particular method is that it assumes that you have only one profile for each instrument, which doesn't really work like that, and that we cannot also recognize using the method absolute pitch. But it's a start. I think it's actually a pity that wasn't followed up on. And this was all about the state of the art. This was the bulk of the tutorial. There is another bulk on more advanced and recent methods. Do you have any questions so far? Okay. So before the break, I will briefly go into data sets. I won't go into detail, but I wanted, with this tutorial, to give you the opportunity to have all the resources that you need in order to work in transcription should you wish to. All these slides, I repeat, are in the tutorial webpage that you can download, so you can access the dataset information directly. So data for transcription, it's really hard to come by, as I've mentioned before. It's relatively easy to do so for piano, much less so for pretty much all other instruments. A bit more recently, people started to come up with an approach for coming up with guitar data by having contact microphones for each string in a guitar, so that you could record the sound from each string separately in order to come up with transcription annotations for guitar transcription.
Sorry, can I ask you something? Maybe I missed it earlier. Could you explain a little more exactly what you mean by an annotated set? Because of course you have plenty of cases with a recording and you have the music.
Yep.
The annotated set is where it's tightly correlated in time. Is that the key thing?
Exactly, yeah.
Okay.
So having a score doesn't tell you anything about the exact timings in terms of seconds. That's one thing. And of course having a score doesn't necessarily reflect the performance, which might deviate from the score as well. Doesn't tell you also about not only about temporal deviations, also from different interpretations or mistakes in the performance, but also doesn't tell you really about playing techniques, for instance, whether there was a vibrato in this case, was a tremolo, a glissando in this case, doesn't really reflect that.
So an annotation, for example, would have a set of pointers from the score to the spectrogram, is that?
Yeah, an annotation. So usually this annotation is in the form of a piano roll. So we try to identify notes over time with a start and end time. This is the basic, the most fundamental annotations that we do.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So why wouldn't you just take MIDI files of all kinds of pieces and run them through good synthesizers?
Yep. Yep.
And just generate recordings like that? Because
Yep.
then you don't, you wouldn't just generate piano stuff. You could generate
Absolutely.
string quartets and brass quartets.
This is actually done.
Yeah.
It's not that good, to be honest, because okay, some sample libraries, yeah, they are really good. I have the Contact player, which is great. It still remains to be seen. So there was a paper a couple of years ago which used the Garrett and Personal Orchestra to synthesize a bunch of MIDI data. The problem with that is that if you don't have performance MIDI, so there's a distinction between what we could call a reference MIDI, a score, which is a temporally quantized representation, with a performance MIDI, a MIDI capture from performance. And if you train a model using scores, synthesized scores, doesn't really work with real audio performances, where real life happens and you have all these interesting problems to solve. Yep. Okay. So, yeah, it's kind of hard to come by with these annotations. We can do this automatically using this clavier piano, using these microphones and guitars. We can do that semi-automatically. So let's say we have a score, a reference score, and we have an audio recording. There is a family of methods in music informatics which is called audio to score alignment. They automatically align a score to a performance. This can be done. It doesn't mean that these methods work well enough, so the timings might be a bit off. Maybe you can do manual corrections based on the automatic alignment to come up with data. Another approach would be, which is kind of interesting, is have someone play back the audio in a MIDI keyboard. So if someone is a trained musician, they listen to the performance and they play back the performance, assuming they are good enough with transcription. And you can, with a lot of manual labor and good performance, get your data. And we usually have either data sets in terms of isolated notes or chords, and we have complete music pieces. For isolated notes, University of Iowa and the RWC database from Masataka Goto in Japan are the most commonly used ones. As I said before, I won't really go into details about the data sets. I just wanted to provide the links for you to download the data should you wish to. And the MAPS database is the go-to database right now if somebody wants to work on piano. For music pieces, there's not that much, especially for non-piano music. The RWC database has 50 recordings of classical music and 50 for jazz music. The MAPS database has quite a few recordings, Western classical music and piano. And the other data sets that are mentioned here are quite smaller and not ready to be used for these more recent neural network approaches which rely on lots and lots of data. Maybe interesting is the MusicNet. This is actually fairly recent, I would say 6 months old, which is symphonic or chamber music pieces with automatic alignment. So still not perfect, but it might be potentially a good resource for someone wanting to do transcription beyond piano. And that was it about datasets, and might be a good time for a 15-minute break.
Okay.
Okay? Thank you.
And by the way, we have still food available. And you guys can enjoy. 15 minutes, right?